everyone to the Preparing for Climate Change and Implementation Guide for Local Governments in British Columbia webinar. I'd like to welcome everyone. Hopefully everyone is online and can hear and see this webinar. I'm just going to get us started now that it's about 11. So as I was mentioning, I'm going to go over a couple of the technical issues first, and then we'll get into the actual webinar details. If you're having any trouble hearing, you can connect either by your phone by calling these numbers, and you can also connect using your computer. In your control panel, if you're using telephone, that should be highlighted, or for using your computer, it's the mic and speakers. And hopefully it looks like everyone nearly has been able to connect to the audio. I also have down here, if you're having technical difficulties, my colleague Charlotte will help you out, and you can email her at fraserbasin@gmail.com. You can also use your chat box if you're having trouble. You can see your chat box on your control panel, and you can email us or chat with us through that as well. So we'd like to make sure that you're not having any troubles on the webinar and that you're able to hear and see us today, or see our slides at least. Just a quick reminder, when you signed in, you are automatically muted. Please keep yourself muted. And if you have questions, you can either use the chat box, or there's also a question section where you can put in questions for discussion later in the presentation. So I think that covers the technical parts of the webinar. And again, I'd just like to say a warm welcome to this webinar that we're doing today. It is the second in a series of Getting Climate Ready. And some of you I know were part of the first one. And this one today is focusing on as I said, there's a bit of I just realized I have a small typo here, but it's the Preparing for Climate Change and Implementation Guide for Local Governments in British Columbia. This is a great guide and a wonderful tool for folks that are looking at adapting to climate change impacts. And today we have 3 very experienced speakers with us. And so once I'm finished doing the introduction, I'll hand it over to them. In terms of just explaining, this webinar is a part of a sort of informal community of practice, which is part of the BC Regional Adaptation Collaborative 2, or you may have heard of it referred to as RAC 2. And I'd just like to acknowledge that we've received some funding for this webinar series from the provincial government and the Climate Action Secretariat, as well as Natural Resources Canada. And it's great to be able to host this, to have everyone here today. So to dive into this, we're going to start with some background on the guide, how it came to fruition. And Cathy Leblanc, who is a senior planner with the Ministry of Community, Sport and Cultural Development, will introduce us to the guide. And then we'll have Deborah Carlson speak a bit more in depth about the guide. She's a staff counsel with West Coast Environmental Law. And then we'll have Corien Speaker, who is the CAO at District of Squamish, and who is also previously was working at District of Elkford, talk about her specific experiences doing this type of work. The questions will be at the end, so they'll be about 15 minutes towards the end, and you'll be able to type in your questions using your question box or using the chat box, whichever you would like to do. But for now, what I'd like to do is get us rolling here so that we can hear some of the expertise. And Cathy's up first, and like I had mentioned, she is well versed in this. I've been working with her on several occasions over many years, and I'm excited to have her kind of kick us off here to get started. And so I'm going to pass it over to Cathy, and she can start into the details on the guide and some of the background on the guide. So I'm just going to pass it over to her in 2 minutes. Just bear with me. Just having a minor slight, here we go. All right, Cathy, so this is going to come to you, and we should be able to hear Cathy in a minute. And
perfect. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All righty. Well, thank you, Elizabeth. So what we wanted to talk today about whether or not your community is ready for a new normal. And what we found is that the climate is changing, and getting ready for those changes and the impacts on the natural and human communities is what adaptation is all about. So my particular goal today is to share some of the resources to help you get ready. So what I found when I first got involved with adaptation was that there was a lot of work happening at the higher level, but there was quite a lack of resources for the on-the-ground planner. So with money from Natural Resources Canada, administration from the Fraser Basin Council, we created the guide. And the guide will help to address some of the issues that communities are experiencing around climate change, whether it's flooding or warmer temperatures, invasive species, and so on. And one of the key issues here is that storms are more intense and they're much more frequent than they have been in the past. And the result of this exploration was the development of the guide. And I think to some degree it's going to be a bit of a lifesaver for people who are just getting started. Because what we found when we actually went out looking was that there were over 90 examples of things that communities were already doing on all kinds of projects. So we assembled those into the guide and developed some checklists with over 125 questions and developed 3 scenarios and pulled it all together in one place to make it easy for local government planners to start doing something right away quickly. So the first step, I think, in all of this is to learn about how the climate is changing in your particular area. So I worked with Trevor Murdoch from the Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium, and what he did quite magically was translate all the squiggles and the graphs and the data from the various climate projections into something that's really usable by planners and engineers, recreationists, and so on. And so this web-based tool will tell you what is likely to be happening in your area in terms of temperature, precipitation, snowfall, and so on. And as the chart on the right shows, what does it mean? So we've put together some information around places where you can start. So this is a very, very, very valuable tool. And nobody else has this kind of resources available to them. So I strongly urge you to go and look at it. The second tool that I think I would really like you to take a look at is the visioning manual that was done by Stephen Shepard from the Collaborative for Advanced Landscape Planning at UBC. And this is where they have developed a tool and a manual that is available for free to local governments in BC that will illustrate visually what the impacts of some of the changes are. So if you look at the mountains on the right-hand side, here's a picture of the snowpack melt, and it's going, and it's gone. So having that information will help planners be better able to communicate the science to their constituents and to the politicians. So the next important thing that I'd really like you to think about is mainstreaming. Here's an example of all the different kinds of things that local government is involved in, and whether it's a development permit or urban forests, we have examples of adaptation ideas and actions in the guide already. And it's really important that everybody, that this be mainstreamed into the policies, regulations, and operations of your local government. Because what they found in Chicago was that some of the very best adaptation ideas came from frontline public works staff, so the folks right on the ground. The next thing we found that was a little bit of a surprise was that you have two key allies when you're doing your mainstreaming, and that is your asset managers and your emergency preparedness managers. And they can really help you a lot in the development of your adaptation strategies. The final point that I'd like to make is that as you're mainstreaming, take a look, upstream, downstream, and to your neighbors to see where the partnerships might lie and where the co-benefits with mitigation might lie. And one of those, for example, is expanding the tree canopy. It has multiple benefits that will, in fact, achieve a number of different sustainability results. So adaptation is essentially a shared responsibility, and it's important to work together to try and create this resilience. Take a look at the guide. I think it will provide you with some really wonderful places to start. And if you'd like more information, please contact me or Deborah Carlson, who is the primary author of the guide. So thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Cathy. That's wonderful. So we're going to move on to Deborah, who I'm just going to give Deborah the ability to get in here on her screen. So Deborah, that should work. As I mentioned, Deborah's with West Coast Environmental Law, and I don't know her so well, but the little bit I've known so far is that she's quite passionate about this. So I'm going to give it over to her.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Good morning, everyone. First of all, thank you to the Fraser Basin Council and the BC Regional Adaptation Collaborative and NRCan and the Climate Action Secretariat for funding, organizing, and hosting this webinar. And thanks, Cathy, for a really excellent overview. I can't believe you distilled so much into such a short space of time. Before I begin, just a quick introduction to West Coast Environmental Law for anybody who doesn't know who we are. We're a nonprofit group of environmental lawyers, and we work on a broad range of environmental issues affecting the province. I'm a lawyer on our Green Communities programs, and in that program we work to develop resources for local governments like this guide, and then we work through outreach to support the implementation on the ground. And I should note that the guide that we're referring to, it's a document, it's more than 100 pages long. I've chosen a couple of things to highlight from the guide, but I encourage you to take a look at it. It's available for free, both on our website and on the Fraser Basin Council retooling.ca website. And I've got a link at the end of the presentation to the location on our website. So this morning I'm going to just review, because I think for those of you who are just starting out, it doesn't hurt to just keep having a reminder about what it is we're talking about here. So what's climate change adaptation and why does it matter for local governments? Again, very briefly, some of the local context for climate change impacts in our province. And then the area I'm going to focus on this morning is something that Cathy has just mentioned as well, because this is something that really seemed to have come up in our outreach efforts around the guide as sort of it seems to be something that local governments find helpful in getting started, this idea of mainstreaming. Otherwise the problem sometimes seems kind of overwhelming, but when you have this idea of mainstreaming, it starts to seem approachable. Then I'm going to give you 5 BC examples, and then just to round off the discussion, because I am the Green Communities lawyer, green is good, and there's definitely an overlap between making your community greener and making it more resilient to the impacts of climate change. So what is climate change adaptation? This is a pretty technical definition from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, but basically it's adjusting to making adjustments in natural human systems to the change in climate, and you can look at it from the point of view of reducing harm that's associated with the change in climate, or also there might be opportunities, benefits. I mean, the classic one is always saying, you know, further north people are going to be able to grow grapes and produce wine. Whether that's actually going to pan out or not, I'm not sure, but that's just one example. And, you know, we've had more attention in recent years on climate change mitigation, I would say, for local governments in BC. You know, we've been setting targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, developing community energy plans. Those efforts are still critical, but we also have clear evidence that we're going to face some impacts based on the current levels of greenhouse gases already in the atmosphere. So we need to prepare. So just a reminder, there's both climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation, and local governments really need to think about being engaged on both fronts, as it were. And there are some overlaps, as you might have noticed in the last slide, that the second to last slide that Cathy showed with the Venn diagram with the adaptation actions and mitigation actions. But they are going to require separate approaches in general and separate planning. So right now we're living in communities that were shaped by decisions that reflected historical conditions based on a stable climate, but the future conditions are going to be different. The advantage we have, though, is that we do have information about the changes, and we do have this fabulous resource in the province of BC, Plan to Adapt, that Cathy has also referred to. So again, why local governments? Why the emphasis on local governments? Well, because local governments are directly affected with respect to land use planning, with respect to infrastructure, emergency planning, financial planning. So everything that local governments are engaged in practically is going to be touched by climate change impacts. And the other thing is, as you know, if you work in local government, you're the place where citizens turn. You're the point of contact for them when they have questions and are looking for solutions. So these two things combined mean that there's going to be a lot of emphasis on climate change adaptation at the local government level in the years to come. Again, especially if you attended the previous webinar and heard from Trevor, you already have some idea of the climate change impacts in the province, but just to highlight a few, definitely there's going to be impacts on water resources. We're looking at a reduced snowpack, earlier snow melt, an increased flooding risk in many areas, also droughts, sometimes in the same areas, warmer water temperatures, which is important. Has an important impact on fish habitat, for example. We already have had really significant insect outbreaks, including the mountain pine beetle. We're looking at sea level rise in coastal areas, greater risk of extreme precipitation events, increased freeze-thaw cycles, which can have really big impacts at the local government level in terms of maintaining roads and having equipment and salt ready to deal with that, and also increased risk of forest fire in many areas associated with drought and also with the insect outbreaks like the mountain pine beetle. So just a reminder, don't get too bogged down with uncertainty. There is obviously an aspect of uncertainty about this. We're dealing with natural processes that we don't fully understand and can't fully measure, but it isn't as uncertain as you might think. There's really no mistake about the direction things are heading in. There's some uncertainty about when some of the impacts will actually be here. But the thing is, it's coming soon, and all the information we have coming out of the climate monitoring and projections that are going around the globe is that it might be moving a little bit faster than even we thought. So when you look at land use planning, the cycles of development and redevelopment, infrastructure life cycles, we really have to be proactive, because it's kind of like turning a large ship. We can't wait until the last minute because we're going to run into the iceberg. So today we're going to focus on this idea of mainstreaming climate change adaptation. And there is, in the guide, if you just take a look at the way it's set up, if you go through the table of contents, in particular the section part 2 on implementation, that really gives you an idea of an approach to mainstreaming, because we've basically broken down almost every area of local government service and responsibility and talked about how climate change is going to impact those areas, and then we've given a bunch of examples of what local governments are already doing to prepare themselves. So one way to look at this then, this idea of mainstreaming, rather than saying what's going to happen, what are all the things that are going to hit my community, but look at it from the point of view of what you're actually doing. So as one observer has said, what do we do, and how should we act to be prepared for climate change? So what you're looking at really is an open-ended process. There's not going to be one answer. You're not going to come up with a climate change adaptation plan. It's going to be evolving over time as different impacts affect different areas of service, and as you learn more, you're going to be improving over time as you get more information. there's going to be a lot of coordination involved. Planners, engineers, emergency management, financial planners, looking at asset management, parks people, everybody needs to be engaged, and everybody will have valuable information to put into the process as well. And it's also all about identifying opportunities and being not just identifying opportunities, but being really opportunistic as well. Like when you have an opportunity for infrastructure replacement, for example, let's put climate change into the mix now. Same thing, there's a larger development project coming along. Take a look at the climate change impacts that development will be facing, because this is an opportunity to put some solutions in place. And just one example to illustrate how this big picture approach can be helpful in considering the impacts in different ways. The Cariboo Regional District did some investigation into climate change impacts they'd be facing, and one of the things that they came up with was, you know, there's a lot of focus on, for example, on for good reason with flood risk and wildfire risk, these sort of concrete physical things that we see happening, but they looked a little bit further, and one of the things they noted is that their tax base is likely to shrink as a result of climate change impacts on the forestry and forest industry. So they have some issues to consider about their tax base and levels of service as a result of that. Now, the good news is that local governments really are well set up to implement climate change adaptation actions. Local governments have the capacity to plan for the future and to mainstream effectively. Two of the key tools obviously are regional growth strategies, these broad land use plans with that go for a period of 20 years, and also the municipalities will be required to provide regional context statements to bring their policies in line with regional growth strategies. So that's an opportunity to look into the future and take some broad approaches to dealing with climate change. Similarly, official community plans, also forward-looking, with plans about land use and development for the future, also very, very useful. And in fact, what we're seeing over time now is a trend for official community plans to have a longer-term horizon. Technically, according to the Local Government Act, they only have to be for 5 years, but in many communities now they're looking much further into the future, 15, 20 years, sometimes even longer. And this is making them really amenable as instruments for putting in place climate change adaptation strategies that are forward-looking. Now I'm going to turn to some examples of what mainstreaming looks like. But before I do that, I just wanted to give you a reminder that there is a process of getting to mainstreaming. We're really talking about implementation in this webinar today. But before that, there is a process of learning about the impacts in your communities, combining scientific and local knowledge, assessing the risks and vulnerabilities that are particular to your community, and then setting priorities. And you can see the guide for more information on that, and particularly in the appendices of the guides, there are some helpful checklists that can get you through scoping out some of the impacts in your community and some of the places that you should be looking for impacts. But once you're there, how do you actually start doing something? This is where mainstreaming comes in. What will adaptation measures actually look like in your community? Now, of course, these are just examples, but I've tried to pick some communities from around the province that are dealing with a variety of challenges so that you can get an idea of what this looks like. And I've also tried to choose a couple of examples. The first one is Surrey, and another one is going to be Prince George, where they have more materials for you online that you can follow up with. Now, Surrey, for example, has just released a draft adaptation strategy. It's on their website. And I've pulled out a couple things that I thought were particularly interesting from that strategy. One of the things is that over 30 staff from different departments work together to assess vulnerability and risk. And if you're a smaller local government, you might not have 30 staff to be engaged, but it just gives you an idea that there was a real range of staff involved in this assessment. It really engaged, there was a lot of internal collaboration involved. In terms of measures, here's just a couple of ideas again. They are talking about incorporating climate change into the City of Surrey integrated stormwater management plans and other efforts to integrate land use planning and stormwater management. So putting climate change right into these stormwater management plans. That's an example of mainstreaming. Another example, they're going to integrate climate change into the 10-year servicing plans of relevant departments. So again, integrating, it's not going to be necessarily there. To begin with, it looks like a standalone adaptation strategy, but what it really is a process of moving the adaptation measures into the activities that the local government is regularly engaged in. And then a final example, they're going to strategically acquire a diverse representation of ecosystem types as part of Surrey's parks and natural areas, just so that they can hopefully make a contribution to maintaining the biodiversity reserves and inventory of the region. The City of Prince George also has been engaged in a very comprehensive climate change adaptation effort. They've been working on this for a few years now, and they also have some very good resources online, and they even have some short videos about their experiences in preparing for climate change. So I really encourage you to go to their website and check those out. As most of you know, Prince George, it's at the confluence of the Nechako and Fraser rivers in the northern interior, and flood risk has historically been a problem there, and they've identified that it's going to be an even greater problem in the future. And they've already worked to do some rezoning. They're adapting their stormwater infrastructure. They're designing new infrastructure to account for a greater flood risk, and they've also updated their emergency response, or I think actually it was a new emergency response bylaw to deal with flood risks. Another risk that they're facing already in relation to climate change is a greater wildfire risk. The area around them has been quite heavily affected by mountain pine beetle, and that's created a lot of fuel for fires. And so they've been working for a few years to do some fuel treatment around the city, and also they've worked out a community forest agreement and are using these measures to help the community prepare better for climate change. Another risk that they identified is related to steep slopes and erosion and greater precipitation, and so they're considering the impacts there and putting in place some solutions. And finally, just three more quick examples of mainstreaming in practice. In Sunshine Coast Regional District, in their West House Sound OCP, they have a shoreline protection and management DPA, and they've included climate change in that. And I think this is notable for a couple of reasons. One, because it is this approach of mainstreaming. And so, for example, the guideline says that that development permits must include an assessment by a professional of the impact of the proposed development on existing and anticipated shoreline processes, including erosion and deposition of land and beach materials, given projected environmental trends, including climate change and sea level rise. Now, I think this is important because you, as local governments, you're often relying on information that's provided to you by qualified professionals. And I think we're not quite at the stage yet, and there are various developments within the professions that they're self-regulating to manage these. But at this time, we're not at the stage where you can necessarily be sure that if you're getting an opinion from a qualified professional or an assessment, that they will have included climate change impacts in that assessment. So it's important to spell it out as it's done in this in these development permit guidelines. Another example is City North Vancouver Subdivision and Development Control Bylaw. Big rain and windstorms in 2008 brought down a lot of trees and highlighted the vulnerability of power lines and other infrastructure that's above ground. So now in their subdivision control bylaw, in certain areas they specify that underground power lines are now required. Village of Caslow in the Kootenays, Caslow has taken the step of specifying in their official community plan that council must consider climate change when it's reviewing development applications. And any bids, tenders, contracts that are put forward to the village of Caslow must reference climate change and the Caslow Adaptation Strategy. So there you go, three good examples of mainstreaming.
Sorry.
Hi, I'm just about done. I have 2 more slides. Am I more or less on time?
Yeah, if you can wrap it up, that'd be great.
Okay, and just to highlight that there are definitely co-benefits between green measures in your community and resilience. There was a really interesting study done related to in relation to Boker Creek on Vancouver Island, and modeling showed that three green infrastructure measures, rain gardens, green roofs, and enhanced topsoil, could effectively address what was projected to be a 22% increase in precipitation as a result of climate change. And this is significant because if you think of if you were going to have to increase gray infrastructure, that is pipes and drains, by 22%, that could be very expensive, and it just, if you think of the undertaking of digging up all the pipes and so on, it's quite significant, whereas these three measures, which themselves also have other benefits, they can potentially help the community deal with those changes. And we haven't got some numbers yet for the province, although we're working on that. But elsewhere, the cost-benefit analysis has been done, and it's quite compelling. In Portland, they found that the green streets and other measures are saving them more than $200 million in infrastructure costs. And similarly in New York, by protecting their upstream watersheds, they estimate that they're saving $2.4 billion over 20 years. So there's definitely a business case to be made for these measures. Finally, I just would like to thank a few of our sponsors in addition to the Regional Adaptation Collaborative. And thank you. And there's a link to the guide, and there's an example of a very well adapted memo. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deborah. I really appreciate all that detail that you've put in there. I'm going to turn it over to Corien now, who, as I mentioned, is the CAO at Squamish, but also previously was at District of Elkford and has been doing some very concrete work in this area that we would love to hear about. So, Corien, please share your experience with us.
Thank you very much, and thanks to both Cathy and Deborah for your overviews. It brought back the project that was very near and dear to my heart for a few years. As indicated, I was in Elkford, and we probably did one of the first more comprehensive projects related to climate change adaptation. We included it within the framework of the OCP when we redid the OCP from 2008 through to 2010, and took that very holistic view of the OCP being the guiding document that helped form the basis of the development of the community. And in order to do that effectively, we needed to make sure that we were addressing all of the risks that were identified that were applicable to the community, and climate change was definitely identified as one of those risks that we needed to factor into our whole community planning process. And for me, going through that process, it was quite iterative and learning. But at the end of it, watching the interest in what we did and how we incorporated it in and mainstreamed it into our OCP was quite inspiring to see that it was influencing activities around the world. So I've just highlighted some of the references and case studies that were done on the project. When we started the whole project, I stood back and said, okay, what does climate change adaptation mean? What are we dealing with? What can we expect to happen in our community? And at that point, PKIC actually helped us identify our risks, what we saw as being the main climate change activities that were going to occur and were going to impact our community. And the consultants that worked on the project actually used this type of a framework, identified what the risk was, what the hazard to the community was, how exposed was our infrastructure to those hazards and those risks, what was the degree of harm that would happen if something occurred, how sensitive the community was to it, and what was our ability to actually adapt to that climate change hazard. The key things that we identified in the process, which have been stressed by both Cathy and Deborah, regularly we see the whole water aspect being identified as being at risk. We identified both the supply of potable water and the provision of water to support the community, as well as flooding that would put infrastructure at risk. One of our key risks that we identified as a problem that we needed to address and that we had the capacity and ability to deal with was protecting the infrastructure from flooding of the Elk River. The primary infrastructure, The primary infrastructure for the water supply, the sewer lagoons, the main highways that served the community were in the floodplain. And the Elk River is a high water river that has extreme fluctuations during freshet. We also identified the need to map the aquifer. We didn't see it as being as critical in the short term, but definitely in the long term, we needed to understand what the supply of water was like and how the changes to the snowpack and the glaciers that were upstream would impact the availability of water. And again, the increased wildfire risk, I think everyone's pretty much identifying that when you live in the forest and you have drier forests and less precipitation, your community becomes a risk. And again, that was something that we could identify, and we could actually do mitigation activities to actually reduce those risks. I just wanted to show the flood in Elkford that occurred this past year at the same time that Calgary flooded. This is the main highway that goes to Fording Coal. There's a bridge right here, and the water's within about 4 inches of the bottom of that bridge. We identified that we needed to dike this area in order to protect the infrastructure. Thankfully, these are the old lagoons in Elkford, but the new lagoons are approximately 1 kilometer south or off the bottom end of the screen of this picture. And the river flowed on both sides of the sewer lagoons, and it took out the sewer outfall. So it definitely put that infrastructure at risk. When we were having the conversations about diking within the context of climate change adaptation, we knew that based on the projections from climate change, freshet would happen earlier and more quickly because of the changes to the snowpack. What's interesting about this flooding picture is this flood occurred 1 month after freshet. If it had occurred during freshet, those waters would probably be about 6 feet higher than they are, which would have caused significantly more damage to the community. So for me, what it means is even though we're identifying these risks and we're trying to determine what our mitigative measures can be, I think we need to make sure that we're looking further down the road as far as what would be the extreme actions that could happen and how do we protect against those. Here's a basic summary of some of the key learnings that I took away from the project. From a local government standpoint, in my opinion, adaptation is more important than mitigation. In my opinion, and it is an opinion, mitigation is about changing the societal norms about how we look at what's causing the climate change that's occurring. And we need to, as a society, change what we do on a daily basis to reduce those effects. But from an adaptation perspective, local government is all about providing safe communities for people to live in. And if we're not protecting our communities from the hazards and the risks that we've identified, then we're not doing our job. We're putting people at risk. We're allowing development to happen in areas that we have identified that are going to be compromised because of climate change. I also discovered that we need to start planning now. It's going to take a while in order to be able to actually manage the effects of climate change. We're seeing that things like doing dikes or changing how we do our standards for development are long-term solutions. So if we don't start now, we're going to miss it completely. I refer to this need to challenge engineering standings. This was my aha moment with the entire process. As we identified the need to improve the diking of the Elk River, we had engineers that designed our dike. We were then applying for grant funding to get the dikes built. And I asked the question, has the dike standards been built in order to protect the community against the future rising waters based on climate change? And two key things came forward. One, that at that point, both the federal and provincial governments were not providing funding to overbuild, and the building was and the construction standards were based on historical information. So when you're looking at floodwater rise, they look to see what's happened in the past, and they design the dikes according to those historical pieces of information. But climate change is not about what's happened in the past. It's about planning for what we're expecting to see in the future. and engineering standards need to develop so that they have a forward-looking projection on how we go about designing our infrastructure in order to protect the community. And both Cathy and Deborah spoke about the mainstreaming. And for me, what that came down to is making sure that every manager, every project, every initiative asks the question, what do we need to do with this project to modify it in order to make sure that we've adapted to the anticipated risks, and that we're able to then protect the community in this project from some of the impacts of climate change. Now, for me, the other part of this is how can I take the knowledge that I learned in Elkford, a Rocky Mountain community, and apply it to the coast. And in Squamish, we have 5 river systems that connect in the valley bottom. The majority of the community is constructed in the floodplain. It is at the interface of the Howe Sound, so we have sea level rise issues as well. So not only are we designing our dikes, but we need to make sure that our dikes are designed in order to protect the community from the anticipated flows in the river systems to manage the runoff, but also to address the sea level rise. And currently, the flood protection standards with sea level is at the existing height. But from a long-term planning perspective as a community, we need to start looking ahead at what's expected down the road. And the province has put in place 2 sea level rise standards for seawall and sea level rise protection, where by 2100 we should be looking at least a meter over the existing standards, and by 2200 we should be looking at 2 meters over that existing standard. Squamish is currently undergoing a project for flood protection management along the rivers as well as the sea level in our Manapement Blind Channel. And we're now trying to project what those dike levels should be basically 200 years from now. And to me, that's what climate change adaptation is all about. You have to think long term. How are you going to ensure that the community is designed in such a way that it's going to be able to sustain the impacts, become resilient to the impacts of climate change? And recently, I just received a copy or a notice of this composite piece of literature that summarized a lot of the adaptation tools that are out there with respect to Canadian infrastructure. And that's where I pulled the map out on the risk analysis for the whole climate change adaptation piece. I found it was another good tool that's sitting out there to look at to help people wrap their head around about identifying the risks and then moving forward on actually designing infrastructure or ensuring that the community becomes resilient. So with that, and I'm going to turn it back over.
Thank you so much, Corien. That is really wonderful detail that you've shared with us, so much appreciated. I will just bring back the screen to myself. And what I'd like to do is open up for questions. So this is a chance for folks on the line, and there are some really experienced folks on the line and a range of folks that might be beginning this as well. Certainly acknowledge that many people may have been even working on some of the projects that were mentioned today, but this is your chance to ask questions to any or all of the presenters. And so as we've mentioned before, you can either type in your question in the question box or your chat box, and I will read them out to the presenters, and we can start to have a dialogue at this point. So please go ahead. To get the ball rolling, if I don't see questions quite yet, I know it sometimes takes a little while, what I was going to do was to ask folks on here your kind of top piece of advice for people that might be kind of in the early stages but have done some background research, kind of how to get the momentum building to get this done in a local government. So I'm not sure if any presenter wants to start that ball rolling.
Sorry, what was how to get it started?
Like, what's your top piece of advice for someone who has started, done some background research, but then wants to actually get this going in their community?
So I guess the first thing to do is to, Cathy here, to connect with your local government colleagues, and if you can figure out, what the impacts are going to be for the community. I think it's really important to sort of get your local house in order a little bit and then go to the public, because I think it's really important for the public to be a really big part of what you're doing. They did that in the Columbia Basin, and they had a series of workshops in different parts of the communities, and they would bring in experts to speak to what the climate impacts were likely going to be, and then they engaged people to say, okay, what changes have you seen in your community? And they did an exercise that initially I thought was really silly, and I had to eat my words on that because it turned out to be absolutely galvanizing to get the people forward. And they had flip charts, and they said, draw a picture of what has changed in your community. And people came up and they drew pictures of people skating on ponds in the winter, and then put a big X through it to say, we can't do that anymore because our water bodies don't freeze. They had pictures drawn of trees blowing over because the wind patterns have changed and the root structure wouldn't support the new wind direction and wind speed. So I think there's a lot of things that you can do to engage the community and bring them along each step of the way.
Yeah, definitely. That's great advice. I'm going to jump into one of the questions we've got here just to get us moving through these. This is from Robert Bartnick. He asks about the 2 meter over 200 year figure for sea level rise. 2 meter is the most probable sea level rise, but the max sea level rise possible under climate change over a century is far higher. Is this accounted for? Any panelists want to tackle that one?
I guess as a sole provincial rep at this point, I would say that the engineers who were involved in that particular study to come up with the 1 and 2 meters looked at a variety of factors, and I think that was their best guess as to the information available at this point in time. So whether it was or wasn't, I don't know. I imagine it was. But I can find out and get back to you if you want to send me a note.
Great, Corien here. I just want to add a little bit to that. One of the other pieces that we looked at as you're designing your mitigative measures to protect the community is there has to be a balance at some point with the cost of putting protective measures in place. If we built dike structures to manage the most extreme event, we wouldn't have communities to live in. So there has to be almost a cutoff point as what's a realistic standard that we can accept right now to move forward. Even doing a 2 meter change right now is huge for developers. If we tried to make that 5 meters, it would probably completely stymie development.
And I think, too, what will happen over time is the numbers will be refined. And I know one of the things that came out of the work in Delta that was done by Stephen Shepard is that they did talk about areas of managed retreat. And because of the visualization work that had been done there, they were able to talk about that idea long before I thought communities were going to be ready for it.
Yeah, and I think also what this illustrates goes as well to the first question is that when you're looking at these issues, it's really important internally to have the conversations amongst the different departments, because there'll be different ways of viewing solutions. If you're primarily talking about these things from an engineering point of view, you start talking about the numbers and how high you can raise things, whereas if you have land use planners in the conversation, you start to think about shifting land use patterns themselves. And of course, you need the emergency management people there as well, just to make sure, for example, if you're talking about wildfire risks, you want to make sure that you have emergency access and exits in new development. So it's really important to have that cross-fertilization of ideas. And that also will help build momentum internally.
Absolutely. And certainly the last webinar in this series, the third one, is going to be a bit more specific on sea level rise, and I'll talk to that in a minute. But I'm going to just throw in another question that sort of follows up on this. This is from Joan Chess. Does anyone know if a government agency, university, or PEng association is working on new standards for infrastructure?
I can't speak for the engineers, this is Deborah, but I do know that the engineers, you know how the engineers have seismic guidelines that they have to follow when they're reviewing projects. I know that they're working on something similar for climate change impacts, and I think it's just, you know, it's a process that's underway, and I don't know the timeline, but you could maybe contact the engineering, the Association of Professional Engineers, and get more information about that. But as I mentioned earlier, I think this is something that local governments have to be aware of, and certainly Corien illustrated that quite effectively in her presentation, that you can't take for granted that the professionals that you consult are going to be giving you advice that takes into account a change in climate, because historically they haven't done so, and their practices haven't been structured in such a way that they would. So it's a really important question to ask.
Yeah, and
can I expand on that just a
yeah.
little? One of the other projects that we were working on in Elkford when I left was the Subdivision Development Servicing Bylaw, and inside there they have IDF curves, which are basically the identification of the intensity, density, and frequency of rainfall events in the community, and they use that information from an engineering standard to design your stormwater management system. And I've been having some pretty intense conversations with Environment Canada and Engineers Canada about redefining how they determine an IDF curve factoring in climate change or changes to precipitation as a result of climate change. So I do know that there's some work that's happening on that. When we were looking at our subdivision servicing bylaw, the advice that we were receiving from both Environment Canada and from the Engineering Association was to increase your IDF curves by about 20% to factor in that uncertainty, at least in the interim, until they can get a more specific engineering standard. So I know that there's work on it, but I think it's individual piecemeal standards at this point. It's not a holistic approach to it yet.
Absolutely. And Stuart Cohen's question sort of follows up on this. Are professional associations, engineers, foresters, etc., supporting their practitioners to work on adaptation if engineering standards are to be challenged? And I think, you know, we do see some of that happening, but certainly there's probably more need of that. I'm going to just throw out another question here from Julie Clark. Are there any funding opportunities specifically for risk/hazard and vulnerability assessment?
Not sure that I'm aware of.
Not sure if anyone else has run across anything that exists. Certainly some other folks on the webinar might want to add to this via chat. I do think there's some, you know, pieces of funding that people cobble together, but there isn't. I know that this is a challenge for many people working in this field. I'm also going to go ahead if someone else wants to add.
I was just going to say that it's something that I lobby for, but I haven't had much success so far.
When I worked on the Elkford project, I was, you know, fortunate that I had some financial support through Columbia Basin Trust to actually proceed with that project. But when we actually got down to doing the vulnerability and assessments and determining where we needed to put our resources to help protect the community, we did most of that at the staff level without external support. If you have a general idea what your climate changes are going to be, i.e. if you're going to have an increased rainfall of, say, 20%, at a staffing level you can at least do a cursory start to identify what infrastructure is at risk and start to put together a plan. So I don't think we need to make it too complex. It becomes part of that mainstreaming. How do you adapt to what you know is going to happen? And I think by using a lot of the resources that you have in-house, it helps mainstream it inside your own local government so that you're taking action and you're not waiting for somebody to tell you what to do.
And just as an observation, in the guide itself, there are a couple of checklists, and the checklists are a bit of a download of all the bits and pieces that I've learned over the last number of years that I've put into checklist forms so that you could sit around your conference table and ask the questions. And I think that would help guide the discussion at staff level. So I think just by asking the questions, things like, are your outfalls at risk from sea level rise or increased storm surge? What I've found is that local government staff know their communities, they know their infrastructure, they know their assets. They may not know the question to ask, so if I can give you 125 questions to ask, I think you can go a long way in terms of figuring out what some of the critical issues are in your community that you might not have otherwise thought of. So that might be a place to start if you don't have a lot of money.
Absolutely. So we're running out of time. One more question here from Renee Pigeon from, I believe, NRCan. In communicating with municipal staff, is it preferable to speak first to the emergency manager who deals with the frightening effects of climate change impacts before raising climate change impacts with municipal asset managers who deal with long-term decisions?
I'll tackle that one. And my bias is towards the planner. Because where asset management, I mean, emergency management is often crisis after the fact. Financial asset management is in the future, and I think planning is your good place to start and bring everybody into the table. So Corien, you may have different idea on that one.
Actually, I pretty much support that. I think that most emergency management personnel, as Cathy alluded to, are after the fact, and they tend to have that put the fear of God in you to make sure that you respond. But from local government, we need to be more proactive, and in order to do that, planning is an ideal place to start. They're the ones that design the future of the community. They pick the areas that are best suited for future development, and they need to start factoring in that there's some pretty significant effects that are going to happen to our communities, and as such, we need to rethink how we design our communities right from the start.
And if there can be a better liaison between planners and engineers, that would be a really strong basis to start.
I think that's great advice. So unfortunately, we're running out of time. The very last question here from Giselle Bramwell is there a website or location where adaptation measures used by various communities can be found easily and shared? So that brings me to the retooling.ca website. In fact, I didn't plant this question, I swear, but FBC has this great resource that is meant for folks like the folks on this webinar, and it's a great database of all sorts of examples of case studies of what communities have done. The implementation guide that we talked about today is there as well, and so I really encourage people to visit that. This webinar recording will be available on that website as well in a few days. I'll send out an email to let people know. And there's upcoming webinars. So the third one in the Getting Ready for Climate Change, Getting Climate Ready, is December 4th at 10 a.m. And it's specifically on sea level rise with Graham Farstad as well as Thomas White. So I really encourage you to sign up for that at retooling.ca. And there's one that's coming up that's not part of this series, but may be interesting for folks. This is through Pacific Climate Impact Consortium. I have their website there, and it's a webinar on BC regional climate summaries that have just been released. There's 8 new summaries that PCIC has, and the webinar will cover that. And to wrap up, certainly feel free to contact me if you have further questions that haven't been answered. In wrapping up, I would just like to thank all 3 speakers. Your advice and lessons learned and insights have been really valuable today. I appreciate all the information you shared. And again, I'd just like to thank both the Climate Action Secretariat and Natural Resources Canada for supporting this webinar series. Thank you so much to everyone who's attended, and I look forward to hearing from you and continuing this important work in our community. Have a good lunch.